button at the
I
bottom?
think, why doesn't Craig do that
Okay, so
at
just
the
give
moment?
it a heads
Because
up.
I've got this other situation with,
Yep.
I see, I can't pull the other up at the
Right.
moment.
So just let him know when you're just about to start and he'll just hit record.
That'll teach me to upgrade between meetings. Okay, we're set to record and
Okay.
to begin the meeting. So, good morning. I am Leslie Tarkington, and welcome to our May Budget Committee monthly meeting. And our members, Leslie Moriarty, Deborah Hess, and Jeff Raymer. We hope that you and your families remain healthy. This is the Budget Committee's second meeting available to town citizens by both Zoom and television. We are grateful to the IT department and Jenny Larkin and Craig Jones for our incredible Zoom support, and to Horst Tepe for our transmission over TV channels 24 and 79 and YouTube. We appreciate the support provided us during this pandemic from Roland Geiger and Pete Minarski and the Finance Department. Thank you. We will not hear from the School Superintendent Tony Jones and COO Sean O'Keefe today, who deferred their application ED11 last month. They found funding within the school's already appropriated funds that this application is no longer needed. We will receive from Alexis Vulgaris, Chair of the Cdbg Committee, and Tyler Fairbairn, the proposed allocation of the Community Development Block Grant funds for our approval. Caroline Baisley, Department Head for Health, comes before the Budget Committee for the BEP to accept grant funds due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We asked Ms. Baisley to brief us on the department's COVID-19 role for the town during this health emergency. I'd also like to add that June's Budget Committee meeting has been rescheduled for June 8th at 10 a.m. during Town Hall working hours, to be held by Zoom also. Town Hall conference rooms will not be open in June. So Ms. Vulgaris and Mr. Fairbairn, let's proceed with the Community Development Block Grant application. And can you give us some background and information? And I don't know, Alexis, would you like to start? Or
Sure,
and just give us an overview of the process, or whatever was your intent?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us to speak this evening, or this afternoon, this morning, whatever time it is in Zoom universe, and give you an update of this very worthwhile and important program, especially at this time. So what you have before you is the recommended program funding for Community Development Block Grant for program year 2020. We have three different allocation categories in this case. We have the public service activities, which are programs. We have public facilities activities, which are capital projects. And then we have planning and administration, which is pretty pro forma. There's a separate category, unique this year, which was additional funds that were awarded through the CARES Act, the Federal CARES Act. And I will talk about that at the end. So let me just sort of run down how we arrived at what we do. We have a group of about 25 members of the advisory committee. They are both RTM members and members of the community, or people who are representing like the Greenwich Housing Authority or Department of Human Services. So we have a broad spectrum of representation. I am very happy that we had two BET members, Mr. David Weisbrod and Mr. Bill Drake, as members of our committee. They were very participatory. And I would like to thank all of the members who, under somewhat adverse conditions, continue to maintain the high standards that our committee strives to meet when we have the very challenging and difficult task of determining which applications with our limited funds deserve the money. We had our public hearing. As you know, we like to go and do site visits. In some cases, we were able to do site visits, but in many cases we were not. So we moved to the Zoom universe or through conference calling. And we were able to connect with every applicant and make sure that what they were applying for fell within the parameters of the organization. So if I may, the public service activities, we had 22 applicants, and I'm very happy to report that the committee was able to fund all 22. It's many of the familiar not-for-profits, Boys and Girls Clubs, CCI, family centers, for others, neighbor to neighbor. The grants range from our minimum of $5,000 all the way up to $10,000. So again, everyone was able to get some. For our public facilities activities, those are capital projects. We had 15 applications, and we awarded or we recommended grants to 10 of those applications. This is by far and away the hardest group to award money to. The grants are often very large, and the funds we have available are somewhat limited. Just to help give you some perspective, we had about $700,000 to work with in this category alone, and the requests came in at slightly over $1.7 million. So we had about 40% of money that would have been available to even help these organizations. Of the 10 that were funded, 2 of the groups submitted multiple awards. So while we took a pass on one, we were able to fund a different one. So an example of that would be the Greenwich Botanical Center and the Greenwich YMCA. They applied for multiple grants. We gave them one out of the multiple. And then the last category in that is planning and administration. And that's just a straight, we cap it, it's about $160,000. And so we pulled $160,000 out of that fund. I'm happy if you want to ask any questions about these, or do you want me to go into the CARES group next? Because that's a separate category.
Well, why don't you continue your, total overview, and then, there will be questions, but why
Okay.
don't we get an overview
Okay.
from you, and then any additional comments from Tyler, and then we can proceed.
Okay. So then let's talk a little bit about the CARES money. So this was an additional $486,000 that we learned we would be receiving in early April. I think it was April 12th. It was a very, very, very short turnaround, less than a week between announcing that there would be these grants and then having the applicants submit the packet. We had 20 organizations apply, and we awarded 12 grants. And the committee was very specific on these awards. So the requirement was that it had to be dedicated to organizations that were impacted and working on COVID relief or directly providing for COVID services to their clients. So our committee made a very targeted decision to only award grants for food and shelter. We felt that under the circumstances, those would be the most likely areas that people would need the extra help. So Boys and Girls Club community efforts, they're working on providing meals to students. We had TAG, which has taken the job of distributing the meals because the bus system isn't running right now, the public buses for the schools. We, of course, very important, had the Town of Greenwich Department of Human Services a rental assistance program to help our residents who might be in need of rental assistance because they've lost their jobs. We had Neighbor to Neighbor. We had Mothers for Others, which is a diaper bank. So it was really about, and very important, the YWCA, we awarded $77,000 for their domestic violence program. I think it goes without saying that domestic violence has been an issue that has been on the rise because people can't leave their homes if they're in a battered situation. And so we want to make sure that we were giving them some money to help that program. And then if there are any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. And I thank you for letting us speak this afternoon or this morning.
Of course. Tyler, do you have anything to add at this point, or are you here, just to elaborate on anything that Alexis has said or anything you'd like to add?
Sure. So I am here to answer any technical questions that there might be. Largely, my role is to kind of call balls and strikes and guide the process. I don't have any input myself, but fortunately we have a very dedicated and involved advisory committee who I think did a really admirable job given, how many different groups we had, and then adding in the twist of, the COVID outbreak this year. So the one thing, the only thing I would add that's a little unique this year is that this will be also the approval of our new 5-year plan. So we have a 5-year consolidated plan that guides each of the annual action plans that we do during the allocation process with CDAC and with the first Selectmen and then the BT and the RTM every year. So that has also been submitted for, as a part of this that was shared, the link that was shared. And, that doesn't have any budgetary approval necessary. It's just outlining the goals and objectives that we will be addressing with the annual plans each year. So if there are any specific questions, I'm happy to answer them.
It's
And
Deborah. Yeah.
So thank you. So I just wanted to add something here, Deborah, before, and then that overall this is an application for $1,478,008. And so that's what we'll be approving. And with this application, it's unique every year. It's consistent but unique that it comes with a resolution, which basically has the heading resolution by the Board of Estimate and Taxation in passing upon the report and the recommendations of the Budget Committee for the 2020 July 1st, 2020 through June 30th, 2021 budget year. And then it goes through Community Development Block Grant, Cdbg, proposed budget for year 2020, and consolidated plan for 2020-2024, or as you've just pointed out, Tyler. At this point in time, I don't plan to read this entire resolution, but I wanted to make sure that everyone understood that this is unique, that it comes annually with a similar type of resolution, and that's what we'll be approving also when we approve this application. So Deborah, I know you have questions, so
yeah, I just have a few questions. Thank you. On the COVID stuff, do we have the cash in the bank already, or is it a commitment to get that money?
So, so all of the Cdbg, whether it's the COVID or the typical annual allocation, is reimbursement based. So all of the organizations who've applied, and we include this in the application and we include this in the contract, it'll occasionally catch maybe some of the newer groups off guard, but the organizations must lay out the money first for these expenses, and then they will come to us with a payment request, and we have HUD reporting forms, and they'll submit evidence that they have in fact incurred these costs, and then the town will reimburse them.
Okay, but did you, because you're getting that incremental grant you said that gave you the COVID, did we receive it already, or do we have to go and ask for that money too?
Right, so that's, we have a line of credit with HUD. That money, once we submit a plan that HUD accepts, they add that money to our line of credit, and then we draw it and issue it as the organizations prove to us that they've made the payments.
Okay, I was just trying to get a sense of just, is there any time lag between the need and the actual getting of the cash? Okay. My other question on the COVID stuff, there's been a lot of money that's been put at COVID. When you went through the granting process, did you consider other money that the organizations may have been receiving, as part of the emergency efforts?
We did. So at that time, we had a very preliminary report from the United Way. I believe that our meeting, I want to say, was on April 22nd. And I believe that the first grants from the United Way were announced to the awardees, I want to say on that Monday, the 20th. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that's the way it was. And we had received a notification that there would be some duplicative efforts. So many of the organizations that applied for COVID funding from Block Grant had simultaneously applied through the United Way. A good example of that was, I believe, the YW Domestic Violence Program.
So
And
they
actually, but Deborah, I think that what's important is that they are requesting very large amounts of money, and unless it was a bundled effort, we would not have been able to fund out of at least our part the majority of the funds. You know, if for example, the YW wanted $130,000 for their request for domestic violence services, we were able to give them 77. But if the United Way can give them some, then they're closer to their ultimate goal.
Got it. And that was really my question, just making sure we were coordinating. And then I think my last question is really, Alexis, for you from an RTM perspective. Are you going to vote on this at your June meeting?
Correct. So it comes before two committees every year. It comes before the Health and Human Services Committee, and I believe it comes before the Finance Committee. And we will take this up at our June 8th meeting. It will likely be after we take up the budget because the budget goes first, but it absolutely has to be taken up in June because there are federal guidelines have to have this in August. So there is absolutely, unless we had a special meeting of the RTM, if for some reason we didn't take it up in June, it must be taken up in June. Otherwise, we will lose the opportunity to get this HUD money.
So thank you. I know it must have been challenging doing all of this under Zoom and remote meetings, and so I just thank you. I know it takes a lot of time, so appreciate it.
Thank you.
Leslie Moriarty, I see you don't have you're on mute, but I think you had a question, at least I saw in an email. So do you want to?
And there is a hand raised in the attendees as well.
Okay, but I'd like to go through the committee members first. Thank you. But I'd like to go through the committee members first. Leslie, and then.
I actually had a few questions. First, I know the process comes from the Cdbg committee and then goes to the first selectman. Were there changes made by the first selectman to the committee's recommendations?
Yes, the first selectman exercised his authority to make one change. He reduced by $16,000. The committee recommended a boiler replacement project at Inspirica. That's a homeless, it helps homeless families. It was a 6-family residence, and that boiler needed some repair work. And it did get partial funding, but the amount that we recommended was subsequently reduced by the first selectman, who then transferred the $16,000 to another program that he felt deserved more money, which was Abalones. And they were requesting a very large grant of, their total request was about $156,000, but they ended up getting about $95,000 to replace lighting and ceiling fixtures at their headquarters in Glenville. So he did, yes, Ms. Moriarty, he did make one change.
So your committee would have granted the full $64,000 to Inspirica that they requested. I'm looking at the sheet.
Correct. Yes, our committee, when it's capital, you may recall last year we had some difficulties with having programs that leave money on the table for too long, and it gets into this sort of inability to draw down enough, and we get into some problems with that. So when we have the money and when we can, and it's not a very large capital request, we do try and fund capital fully so that there's no risk that the organization can't come up with the remaining $16,000, and now that 48 sort of sits out there while they're raising the additional money. So our intention was to fully fund the boiler. It's at the discretion, as I said, of the first selectman to make his changes.
Do you have concerns about that change?
Again, if I have the opportunity to fund a capital project fully, I try and push in that direction. The Abalones staff said that program could be phased. So when we gave the money, or when we recommended the amount of funding, we were recommending it with a phase in place, and we believe that the amount that we were awarding would have gotten us or gotten them through an appropriate phase, and then they could have come back. Coming back is something that often happens. We'll phase things, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3.
Right. And I take it the first selectman hadn't really been involved with the committee and its deliberations prior to the recommendations being forwarded. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Can I've got a series of questions, if that's okay, Leslie. That I think I ask this every time it comes before, so bear with me, but the administration, where we're at the top at 20% of our funding, can you tell us what that administration covers, what expenses that covers?
Sure. And, I got a good suggestion from one of our CDAC members, Leslie, this year. I will start including to our CDAC members the line item breakdown, and I can forward that as part of the package to the BET, if that's helpful. But so of the $160,000, that covers salary for, we have 1.5 staff. It's me and an assistant 3 days a week. And then things like the 401k contribution. There's a $16,000 contribution for that town health insurance. And then office supplies, printing. We have to run a number of public notices in the newspaper for this. So that's included. Really everything we need to operate our office is included in that admin budget, so that I don't believe, and perhaps Roland can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe there's anything on the town side for our office that's not covered through the admin portion of the grant that we take out of the 20%. A little less than 20%. We don't take the full 20.
That's correct.
If you hear a noise in my background, I'm sorry. It's my dog, my elderly dog, who has a cough, and she will always have that cough. I wanted to ask, I was reading the documentation, the full consolidated plan, and I think, Tyler, you mentioned it, that it talks about objectives and goals for 20 to 24, the next 5-year period, that focuses a lot more, it seems, on housing. Are those new priorities? I didn't pull up the last Cdbg document. I don't always skip over those 4 letters, sorry, to compare how the priorities have been set and what you measure yourself against. You also talked about a measurement program, and I didn't know if that was a new initiative as well.
So we, and my goal with this, and I mentioned this to the CDAC committee at the beginning of our first meeting in February, was I think that the best approach for the 5-year plan is you want it to be as broad as possible, so that when you have your annual process, you can, if there's a need and if there's an organization that's trying to meet the need, then cover it through your annual process. And also, be able to kind of move smoothly if things like that do come up, so you don't have to make an amendment to the plan, which would then need to go through the BET and the RTM if we have to make big changes. So we do usually keep the goals and objectives as broad as possible for that reason. That doesn't necessarily mean on an annual basis we'll be spending money on any one of those particular things, but those are among the things we can spend on. Housing is usually a big part of the con plan. So the categories in the plan come from HUD. Those are all sections that we are required to answer as part of the comp plan process. Other communities, and I've worked in several of them doing Cdbg and different HUD programs, have a much greater need for housing rehab programs, home ownership programs, down payment assistance programs than we do here. So we have them in there, but they're not necessarily a top priority, but they are included. Most of our housing projects that we've seen on an annual basis will be coming from the Housing Authority or from some of our supportive and group home providers. So those will come through Abalones or Pathways. Inspirica has been a big requester of funding for those types of things. So it's the priorities and the goals and objectives are in this one are really similar to the ones in the 2015-2019 con plan. I've updated it slightly and added some COVID response goals and objectives as well. That's really the only thing that's unique from the last one.
What about the outcome performance measurement system? Is that a new initiative or has that been in prior plans?
That's an annual process. So we have to submit at the within 90 days of the end of the year, of the end of the Cdbg year, our consolidated annual performance evaluation report, which is another HUD requirement that's kind of tied through their online system to data entry we do when we get payment requests from our organizations. We'll ask them to verify that they've served however many people they served through the Cdbg program, and then we kind of put that all together and send it back to HUD and then make it available through the community development website too. That's part of our public review process.
And does the committee review those kind of in determining its allocations for projects? You use that as a criteria?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we have what I feel is a pretty strong application that will incorporate how many people are expected to be served, how many of those are Greenwich residents, how many of those are unduplicated. So I think one of the things the committee will look at is how many, are we getting the most bang for our buck through each award? So if an organization is getting $10,000 and they're only helping 2 or 3 people, is that really a worthwhile investment when we can invest the same money and help hundreds of people? So it's definitely a consideration, and I think we include that in our application that the committee will factor in the anticipated number served through the grant, and then we'll report back on it just to make sure that the estimated number is close to what they put in for. I remember, I think it was last year, the year before, I know that was a challenge for the YW because they had, anticipated serving, I think, 7,000 people through the domestic violence assistance program, but the state changed the way they count those numbers. So it got cut in half. So when we report on that in our end of the year report, we can put a narrative and explain why things like that happen if the numbers are off for some reason.
I see.
Leslie, I just want to say, one thing is, when we look at our grants, Tyler had said we, look to see how many Greenwich residents are served, but we also have to consider that Greenwich doesn't provide some of the services that Stamford provides next door. And so we do try and make a conscious effort to award funding to long-standing established providers in Stamford that are providing a service to our residents, even if they may be few, because we have the capacity to provide 0. So not only Pacific House and Inspirica, which deals with homeless shelters or the homeless population, but Stamford also has a senior dental care program, which provides dental assistance for free. And if we didn't fund that one, I believe the next closest center that provides that service is on the other side of New Haven near Branford. So we do try and take into account services that are in Stamford that are helping our most needy residents. And without helping them, they would have 0 capacity to get
And I
served.
know that's consistent with how our Department of Human Services also looks
Correct.
at the opportunities to provide services for our residents.
Correct.
At this point, I will let other members ask questions and continue to look through my list, but thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And I'll call on Jeff now. Jeff Raymer.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I just wanted, if someone speaks up to respond, if you could just identify yourself so that when this gets posted that they understand who the person was speaking, that would be appreciated. Jeff?
Jeff Raymer, BEG. A couple of things. One, Alexa, at the United Way, I know there's always sort of a perennial conversation of whether to make a lot of grants in small amounts to a lot of agencies or lesser grants in greater amounts to fewer agencies. Is there a similar dialogue to that goes on?
Sure. So for our public service activities, those are programs. The floor is $5,000. So you need to make a minimum of a $5,000 grant in order for it to make sense in terms of paperwork and administrative costs. And so what we historically do is we look at all of the applicants, assuming that they are all approved, meaning the work that they're approving for qualifies. We start them all at $5,000. And then we work our way up from there. We have not taken the approach that we will cross those folks off the list. So take $5,000 from neighbor to neighbor so we can give 10 to CCI. That's just an example. Because if you look at the list, those organizations, whether it's Meals on Wheels or Neighbor to Neighbor or River House Daycare, those really are the core and the backbone of our local nonprofit service providers in town. And we feel that as a committee, it's important to be able to show our support for all the work that they're doing, even if it's at the $5,000 level.
So it's a little harsh of me to ask questions about specific items. So, you know, I will be forgiving if you don't remember every detail. I apologize, but I had a curiosity about some of them. I know it's a very long list.
Go ahead.
At the Greenwich Botanical Center, the ADA
Yes.
building accessibility,
Yes.
$65,000. Do
Okay.
you recall what that was for?
Sure. So the Botanical Center is a new applicant. They came last year to us and they came back. And this year they came back with a very, very large grant and a more modest grant. So the first grant was for ADA accessibility. We are seeing that more and more with a lot of our capital improvements. And this was to modify a bathroom at the property. And I'm sure you all know it's the old Garden Education, so they've rebranded themselves. And so the $65,000 was to modify a bathroom. The $200,000 was to do a much, much, much larger accessibility ramps and things around a much broader section of the property. $200,000 is the maximum that we allow for a grant. And as a committee, we just couldn't reconcile potentially sending $265,000 of our total $700,000 to one organization. So we took the more manageable amount, which was 65. We gave them the full amount for that. And we hope that next year they will tell us that they have a lovely new ADA accessible facility. And then they can come back. You know, the beauty of this is that all of these organizations the next year can come back and reapply.
I had one other, this one requires a little less specificity, but on the COVID response funds, the funds that went to TAG, did this actually cover the whole amount of their incremental costs for the response they gave to COVID? Do you know?
The TAG feed, the
$96,000 under the COVID
right,
response.
So they requested 100,000. We gave them 96. I don't recall. You know, that's the program that's delivering the meals to all the children. I don't recall if I know the total cost for how much to deliver every single school meal costs. They came at us with 100, and we tried to provide them with as close to that as possible. I apologize for not.
So actually, at 96, you virtually funded the full amount of their request.
Correct. We virtually funded the full amount of their request. What I don't know is if the totality of that program needs 170,000 and they've gone to some other organization, like the United Way, for an additional 70. I don't know that. I apologize.
Just to give a tip of the hat, just because this was one that I had that just happened to receive some information. You know, we so often talk about TAG as being that they frequently get tapped on short notice to provide miscellaneous transportation on things that nobody had anticipated. I know at Neighbor to Neighbor, their original process before COVID called for there to be people filing through at very close quarters and working at very close quarters with staff people on the food side. Probably the same is true on the clothing side. I don't have the familiarity there. And they had to completely change gears, that at the same time as they were having more people seeking food assistance, it was impossible for them to be able to do it safely in that way. And TAG once again was tapped to, would you please be making the distribution to this now very large number of people who are going to be receiving prepackaged bags of food out of the Neighbor to Neighbor program. And without blinking an eye, they took that up and did it. So I was curious to see whether or not they got compensated for it. And I wanted to be sure that since we struggle with the finances with TAG and things, that people are aware that here's an example where on short notice they were asked to fill in a gap, and it was a very important gap, and they filled it in. So
Right.
sorry to make that commercial announcement.
No, I think it's great. You know, I'll give them another plug. The RTM is doing our little Zoomers to Boomers thing with the Lori Contadino over at the Commission on Aging, and we've got 75 RTM volunteers that are calling people over the age of 75, and there's a SWACA grant out there, and we are using that money to fill the grocery bags and get them out there. So I'm very happy is on the move. They're like little hummingbirds in town now, out there distributing everything.
I have
Great.
one more question of the picayune variety. Back in the capital list, Nathaniel Witherell, the exterior rehabilitation work being done at the pavilion. Can I inquire, if you recall, what that exterior work was about?
Sure. So you're all very familiar with Nathaniel Witherell. I know that. So the pavilion has 5 apartments. It's, I believe, either former town employees or current employees. They had, and let me see if I can recall this correctly, rotted trim, pillars rotting, deck floors, railing, basically wood rot. And the feeling is that we wanted, or that the Nathaniel Witherell wanted to make it safe, a little bit warmer in the wintertime for those residents, and the porches, you know, to be safe so they could enjoy their outside space. And so they submitted a request for $160,000. The committee approved or recommended it in full. I'll be honest with you, I think that there were, because we are a lot of RTM members, we looked at it and we said we could either use it in this, or it will come as an interim appropriation probably. And so we decided to fund it. There was very strong support for that. And I know that, Leslie, I mentioned this to you, I think I've been on this committee for, I don't know, at least 10 years, maybe 12. I don't remember Nathaniel Witherell coming in for much. I remember Parsonage Cottage, and sometimes it gets confused because they're next door to each other. So they submitted their application and they got their money.
Alexis, I believe at one point in time, I'm sorry here, Jeff, we'll go back to you.
No, I have more questions.
I believe at one point in time, it did fund an elevator in the Witherell building. And also, I think there was some funding for the greenhouse too at one point in time.
Maybe right, yeah.
But you know, those are sort of the ancillary things. Just sort of adding to this. Jeff, do you have any more questions?
I have no more questions. Thank you, Alexis.
And I see Leslie had her hand up again, so
Yeah,
I'll go.
I wanted to make 2 comments. One is, after listening to the explanation of the change that the first selectman made away from Inspirica's full funding for the boiler replacement to Abalones, which can phase its project, I'm not comfortable with that change. I would like to revert to the committee's recommendation. So Leslie, I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about what that means. Does that mean that I make a motion to make that change at the budget committee, or do I vote against this recommendation? Let me know. But I also wanted to make one other comment. And I noticed in the CARES Act recommendations, the town of Greenwich had submitted a request to reimburse that emergency appropriation that the first selectman had made to the BET, and the BET approved 12-0 for $100,000. I was surprised to even see this on the list. That certainly wasn't the basis upon, I think, I as a member of the BET had made, that we would be looking to provide funding and seed money to raise additional funding to support our nonprofits, and that the town would be seeking it back. So I wouldn't have supported that submission and to start with, and I am glad the committee and the first selectman didn't choose to try to refund the town.
Leslie, may I just comment on that? So that was a challenging decision for our committee. We voted unanimously to not even consider that. And I think that certainly when you only have $486,000 and you're looking at organizations that are truly on the front line, whether it's Neighbor to Neighbor or TAG or Mothers for Others, there was absolutely zero appetite by anyone on the committee to take close to a fifth of our total money awarded to reimburse the town of Greenwich. So that was not going to happen. And honestly, I've never seen a reimbursement request come in before like that. We've also never had COVID, but I think the committee was certainly very committed in saying, no, we will not be reimbursing, taking money from other providers to provide and reimburse the town.
Thank you.
So I know Beth has her hand up, but I
So does
also,
Deborah.
okay, so Deborah, you can, I also have some questions, but Deborah,
Yeah,
please
you
go ahead.
can go first. I just wanted
No,
you
no,
to know that I had my hand up. You could go.
I was just going to ask some questions here to Tyler or to Alexis. I mean, to me, the additional money that we received, the $487,000, is, you know, because of COVID, is very important to the town in this time, in this environment. And but that is our federal tax money. And so I'm just as sensitive about, you know, what we're spending, because in the end, I'll be paying for my taxes as I am about my own property taxes in town, and for all of us who pay both. So when I looked at the $487,000, and as Alexis knows, as chairman of the Health and Human Services Committee of the RTM, I attended that meeting last week when that committee approved the budgets for the Senior Center, Commission on Aging, for GEMS, and for the Health Department. They were honestly, in my time on the BET, three of the most touching times that I've had as I listened to what each of those three departments are doing to support all of our town residents in this time of need. And my guess is that there are more senior residents just because of the way the virus has hit than other residents. So my questions really relate to this. It sounded to me from those discussions that there were almost like extreme needs and pressures on those three departments. And GEMS is not a department, but, you know, 501c3, but nevertheless, we fund them substantially, and they were being presented because of that. Did any of those organizations, departments, get their name on this list? And, you know, as example, I was very touched by the Senior Center saying if only they had the money to fund 10 more, you know, food bags for, you know, these extreme elderly, and, you know, that aren't being able, they're sheltering in place, they're not able to get, you know, out and so forth. You know, did these organizations, did people reach out to these organizations, others than the normal, who are used to applying and saying, this is an emergency, you know, you have emergency needs? What really touched me is none of us have heard, even though you know, from any of these departments to the best of my knowledge, and, you know, in an emergency time. And I guess they're so busy doing their businesses. But what I also heard is how they're reaching out to look for other grants or CARES money or whatever. Were they aware of this? And, you know, I mean, Leslie talked about a potential change, but is there anything that we should be doing any differently as we learn about the initiatives being taken by, you know, the departments or areas that, you know, as an example, Senior Center, Commission on Aging does have a 501c3, et cetera. So I'm not talking about funding the departments. I'm talking about addressing special needs in a special time of pandemic.
Sure. So to answer part of it, Leslie, and this is Alexis speaking for the record, the town of Greenwich did apply. Their Department of Human Services, we awarded them $50,000 for rental assistance. So that was a department that sought specific funding under this program. I would love to see something like, the Commission on Aging, if they had a unique program that qualified where they could provide something to their residents. However, the good news is that so many of these programs are interactive, and I think that's what's important to remember, is that we gave additional money to Meals on Wheels. So when somebody comes to the senior center or reaches out to Lori and says, I need help with food, we've now given it to the provider who in theory should be able to assist that program. There's also some Southwest Agency on Aging, SWACA. We got a very large grant to provide food for seniors. I want to say it's $1 million, but don't quote me, but it's a very substantial grant. I can let Tyler speak to how he communicated to the agencies about this opportunity for extra COVID funding. But I also wanted to say that the Department of Human Services is very good at working with many of the same organizations that we have on the COVID funding. And I think we've tried to quilt together a good way to help our most needy and fragile residents at a very difficult time. It's not a perfect system, but everybody is working together to make sure that the people who need the help most have some opportunity to get some help.
So I'll just add another one. I mentioned senior center, but another one was GEMS. To know that they're going out and they are actually touching these COVID-19 residents, patients, and yet they're comments about how they don't have or didn't the N95 masks and no gowns because they've never needed gowns as such, and the different kind of pressures they put on their budget. Again, even their new facility, quite frankly, I do think that, and I haven't thought about this myself, I would encourage, particularly if there's any changes here, to, think about, do we need to, help them apply for these in this emergency situation? It is an emergency, and, we need to keep our eyes open for all of this very special support system that we have in the town to make our quality of life better for all ages and everyone.
Can I just address the PPE? So one of the criteria is that the agency to qualify for the COVID funding is ineligible to get funding from any other source. So in cases of PPE, there could have been opportunities through FEMA grants or other organizations or entities that are helping specific to healthcare providers, which is one of the reasons, if you look at our list, Pathways and Parsonage Cottage both applied for PPE and cleaning, and we took a pass. We had done some research and we found that those agencies or entities could have accessed funding to address those needs outside of block grant. So block grant, think of block grant as the last resort. You have no other funding options. Some of the PPE needs do have other options. I don't know if Tyler has any more detail on that, but that's, GEMS and PPE probably wouldn't have worked.
Okay, so again, we're learning, but I don't know that there's a specific person in the town that's helping to guide these various and sundry departments, or in case of GEMS, it isn't a department, but agencies that are like part of our town almost in terms of what we fund them in terms of external entities, and so they may need, in my opinion, this was an emergency, and these people, those three departments or organizations that I mentioned earlier that attended your meeting and whose budgets were approved, are going full out because of the emergency, and may or may not be aware of the grants or what they should be doing also. And this, from my standpoint, means that, you know, if it's at all possible, that we try and offer the support system to them. I have another question about the Health and Human Services Department. Obviously, they addressed one piece, which I think Leslie has addressed, and thank you, Leslie. But the other piece is, you know, we're looking at our budgets for the town departments at flat to the current year, and that particular department has many external entities which they fund or they want to fund. And I was wondering if there's a coordination here that they would have considered, you know, perhaps funding as appropriate that fits into this program, you know, an external entity or two or three, rather, you know, rather than because of money being flatter, doing it within the department. So I was wondering, was Health and Human Services sort of that kind of approach considered also, as well as their additional needs?
Sure. So one of the things that I think I instituted probably 5 years ago was doing a comparison between who receives money through our external entities program, which, don't forget, that was shifted to Human Services, the Department of Human Services, over the years. I believe it for a long time, it used to sit in external entities, maybe not with Human Services. That's
but Alexis, you're correct, but we still have external entities, you know, which is where we fund TAG or
sure.
So, GEMS, et cetera. But there was only a couple and they were shifted. Now there's many, as you know.
Right. So with that, what we do is we do try and look, and you will notice, and I apologize for not having the exact figures, but most of the organizations that are getting public service activities, so those in our regular cycle or the program, are the same organizations that are getting money through external entities. So the Right program or CCI or Boys and Girls Club. And that goes back to what I had said earlier, which is their need is very large. And so they have to identify multiple avenues to parceling or quilting together their requests. So they'll get some from the Department of Health, the Department of Human Services, they'll get some for block grant, they'll get some from United Way, not their COVID relief, just regular United Way contributions. And then they'll hopefully have enough to make the program run. It's very, very challenging. Some of the organizations on the list have very large and robust fundraising opportunities. I know not now because all the galas and things have been canceled, but they do. While others are, you know, very small organizations that just don't have the same sort of robust response for fundraising. So to answer your question, we do try and coordinate. Long way of saying that.
And then I have one more, it's more of a comment, you know, and that is just on the pavilion. You know, again, since it was considered, you know, in the Kavunas plan, you know, what the original plan to do something at the Witherall, which again was probably the first time, what was the first time HDG was brought in. It was brought in by the RTM. Later, it was reviewed by the, you know, very globally renowned, sophisticated two engineering firms at when Project Renew was done, and there was a report to the BET, et cetera, et cetera. I just, when in both of those decisions, the pavilion was to be demolished, and certainly in terms of the second time, there were no residents at the time. And I just find it, you know, I just wonder whether we need to make sure we're all working together and not dealing in emotion as we make some of these decisions. I have one final.
You said you had one
comment here.
question 3 questions ago, Leslie.
Okay. No, I have another one about Call a Ride. Is Call a Ride something, you know, again, it's something that the seniors use. You mentioned in terms of the Cdbg, CD Cares Act, et cetera, that you said food and shelter, but obviously TAG is there. Call a Ride is also, you know, an important part of our senior support network, but my guess is most of those volunteers are seniors too, and, you know, they're probably concerned about their own situation and whatever. So were they considered, or do they ever apply for this program, Alexis? Or
I've never
Tyler?
seen, you know, it's funny. So I've never seen Call a Ride apply. We do a very large broadcast of encouraging people to apply. And over the years, we've seen some organizations that have dropped off despite having been robust participants, and then others sort of swoop in. And I alluded to it, you know, 2 years ago, we'd never seen anything from the Botanical Gardens, and now they're here. We've had other groups that, you know, the Housing Authority is one that often applies for things, and they were very modest in their requests this year. The one group that I have said I wish they would apply for more, and they are the most humble group, is Meals on Wheels. I cannot get that board to say apply for more money. We would give them more than $5,000. That's a group that I think the committee has always said we'll give you $7,000. You'll look at their requests for COVID. They applied for $3,500. I mean, it's quirky, you know. You never know who you're going to get to apply, and you never know how much they are going to apply for. And it's a hodgepodge sometimes.
Thank you, Deborah. I think.
Okay, just quickly, a couple. I just want one thing you said, Alexis. I just want to clarify. So, are you saying on the COVID bucket, so anyone in that bucket that's getting money is not getting PPP or any other?
Correct. So, well, no. The way it works is that we only wanted to dedicate that money to those providing food and shelter. So there were some organizations like Pathways, which is a residential facility. In theory, a residential facility has other mechanisms or avenues or funding sources to secure PPE. It might be through FEMA, for example. So if they would first need to contact and identify, and I'm sure they're aware of what those sources are because they're using them now, to make sure that they have checked with them first to see if there are any funds that they can acquire through FEMA or whatever other grant. But it shouldn't be, if you're eligible for FEMA and you're not applying for FEMA because you just don't want to do the paperwork or whatever, you come over to block grant, right? Block grant is the absolute last stop. So the feedback we were getting was there are opportunities to get PPE equipment through other healthcare channels. And that's why we took a pass.
Okay. And then my other one, in terms of, I know Leslie Moriarty made a comment about, you know, potentially wanting to change this. You know, there was a shift in the First Selectman's office. Quite frankly, I don't know why the shift was made or the rationale behind it. I wouldn't be comfortable approving any change to what's being presented us today without understanding that more, and would suggest if there's going to be a change, that maybe that would be part of the full BET meeting on Monday, because I would need more information to even consider something like that. I'm sure there's a reason behind it, and then based on that, we can make our own decision. And from a process standpoint, Pete, how do we need to approve this at the budget committee? I'm just trying to understand the process, because I'm not sure that we're going to be able to agree, because if you're going to propose making a change to something that's being submitted, I would not be able to vote in favor of that without having more information.
So Deborah, before we get to Pete, and I'm interested in Pete, I mean, quite frankly, I am not aware of any changes ever being recommended or made by the Budget Committee ever before. And I do want to hear from Pete. And before we get to a vote, I also want to bring up Mike and ask him if he is aware of such a something. I mean, we certainly can say that we want discussion of such an item, you know, if Leslie wants to add that at the full BET meeting. But I am not prepared, since Leslie did not give any indication of this in advance, being prepared to do anything outside the norm, but certainly we'll ask Mike. And now, Pete, I think Deborah's asked you, so would you like to opine here?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I missed it.
No, that's fine. I'm just trying to get a sense of if, you know, the Budget Committee doesn't approve this, the process, because I know it sounded like Ms. Moriarty may want to suggest a change to this, and I think Leslie Tarkington and I are both of the view I really don't have a basis for accepting any change to this at this point. So just trying to understand the process by which we can approve this, and it feels like we might be better served with any potential changes being dealt with on the BET when we have some information to consider in advance.
I don't recall the Budget Committee ever making changes to the, I might defer to Jeff or Mike or Roland. You do have a public hearing, and then on Monday, and every year, almost traditionally, no one ever speaks at the public hearing. And I don't historically ever remember this document before you being changed at this level. And again, I'll defer to Jeff, Mike, or Roland if they recall.
So I'll speak to that. Clearly, the board has the prerogative to make changes, and the committee, meaning the Budget Committee, has the right to recommend changes. The fact that we've never made changes in the dozen years that I've been here doesn't mean that there's not standing to make the change. The rest of what Deborah was referring to is the question of how she is motivated to vote, which certainly is her prerogative. But Leslie Moriarty certainly has the ability to make the motion. If seconded, it draws a vote. Depending on the vote, the recommendation is made or not made, and it can come up as a motion again at the full BET for a vote there. It might be useful if I can ask Tyler, since Deborah raised the question, Tyler, could you kindly make inquiry for us to the first selectman to share with us his rationale for making the change that he made, so the full BET will have the benefit of that at the time of Monday's meeting?
Yeah, I'll absolutely do that. I will ask him for perhaps a formal response that I can share. My understanding in discussing this with him and in discussing Cdbg when I first met him when he started was that he had heard from some residents, I think even going back to his time when he was serving at the state level, that I think his interest was to keep as much funding as possible in Greenwich. I think he was aware that we give some money to some organizations who are operating in Stamford, but who do serve Greenwich residents. And I think he absolutely understands that and wants to be a part of that. But I think the shift from Inspirica to Abalones was because of the, where they operate. But I will ask him that formally and get an email or something in writing that I can forward on to the committee.
Thank you.
So Leslie has her hand up again. If it's about the same subject, we can. Otherwise, I know Beth has been very patient, and I'll come back to you, Leslie.
It's the same subject. You made a reference that I did not submit my question in advance, but I do want to identify that the documentation that we received on this didn't indicate that there had been a change from the commission to what we submitted. So we didn't have that information before this meeting right now. And in preparation for Monday's meeting, I don't know if this is a fair request, but we did get a response from Alexis as to how the committee determined its recommendations, which is to fully fund capital projects so they can be completed because without a full appropriation, you may need to wait for next year's funding. And I'm not sure what conversations there have been with the first selectman in justifying the change, but it may make sense to ask the committee to explain that on Monday night as well, or to submit that in writing, or however the chairman wants that information out there. But you certainly want to understand kind of both sides of the issue. And I wanted to ask the follow-up question: has there been in the past, and maybe we're in lots of new grounds here with this BET, but has the first selectman typically made
I
changes?
knew that was coming, Leslie. It's Alexis. So once in all my years on this, it's only been once. And at that time, the first selectman, so I've been chair for 5 years, and historically after our committee makes its recommendations, I'm called into the first selectman's office to do a summary and a debrief and sort of explain how we arrived at our suggestions or our recommendations. And only once has it ever been changed, but it was done more in concert with the committee at that point. We forwarded it on to the first selectman, and he has the purview. It's within his right to change things. I was not brought in on that process, which is his right.
So I remember one time, and I don't know if it's the same one you remember, and I believe the first selectman actually had a public hearing. I don't know if there was a public hearing involved in this decision. So this is something new. We're treading new ground.
There was a public hearing. Sorry. There was a public hearing. Tyler, when did we have that public hearing? It was about 10 days ago, I think.
It was April 29th was the first selectman's public hearing on Cdbg.
So at that public hearing, we did hear from all of the applicants. But at that meeting, it was not disclosed if any changes would be made.
Thank you very much. And in terms of what Leslie said, she had just emailed just prior to the meeting about her question about the first selectman. So I thought perhaps she had some heads up on that issue. Beth, I think you've had a question, and let me see if hopefully you're unmuted now. Beth Crummick? Hello,
She's
Beth?
unmute. She's
okay.
Oh, there she is.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Beth Crummick. Okay. Two things. Just one comment. Is it possible, Alexis, to get the list with what was requested and what was agreed to by the committee for Monday night's meeting? It's just.
Oh, you have it. Sorry, you don't have it, Beth?
Well,
Yeah, she should have it. Beth, it was published first thing yesterday morning as an addendum to the packet. We published it as soon as, I asked Tyler if we could get a copy of the 151 page.
It's
booklet.
151 pages. Yeah.
And so it was
stand
published
corrected. I
as an
just saw it.
addendum, and after the meeting, I will send you the Elaine Brown's link to this package, which is online, posted online.
I think what Beth, this is Deborah Hess. I think what Beth is asking, though, to be fair, I think she wants to see maybe what the committee recommended versus what change maybe the first selectman may have made. So I think it's just a matter of saying there was one shift and just making it explicit what that one change was. Is that what you were asking?
No.
Okay.
I know we had 150 pages. I'm saying one sheet that shows us what they asked for and what they got, which
It's
is
in there.
a one.
It's page 2, Beth. I'll send you the link.
Okay.
Page 2.
Mike,
And did you have another question?
I have a specific question on the YMCA, and I just wanted to understand why the money, 40,000, was put toward a mind and body program versus a pool rehabilitation. So I'm just trying to understand
Yep.
because I would have thought pool rehabilitation would have been a capital request that would have been approved.
Okay, so this is where it's always very, very, very hard. And I know, Beth, you've served on block grant with me. So there are a couple things. This is it was a pool dehumidifying system. And that's an example of the total cost far exceeded the $200,000. I want to say maybe it was in the 350 range. So again, what we try and do is we try and look at a capital program that we can fully fund, so we are not backing ourselves into the timeliness issue that we all experienced last year with some of our providers who, had they not been able to sort of close projects, we would have lost the ability to have block grant. We were in danger of losing about $500,000. So let's talk about the Parkinson's Mind and Body program. Is a new program. It's something that's unique, and it's like a boxing program, a physio boxing program. And this is where a tracking system so that people who have Parkinson's can do some movement. That we were able to fully fund. So, they submit, we close it out. The pool gets into some other issues that the committee raised, which is the goal of any of these is that they have to serve a majority of low income or below the poverty level. And the question is, does that pool serve that a majority of that population? It wasn't entirely clear, it's a smaller pool. I believe it's not their Olympic sized pool that their competitive swimming program swims out of. But the reality is that again, a $200,000 grant is a huge amount of money when you only have $700,000 to work with, and it wouldn't have satisfied the full cost of that capital project. And it's also one, Beth, that was not easily phased. If it's sort of, you have to be careful how you phase programs, because I'll give the example of years ago, somebody applied for a vehicle. Vehicles aren't allowed, but you can't, if they need a fire truck, you can't only fund 3 wheels on the fire truck. You have to do the whole kit and caboodle. So that's why the pool didn't get
Oh, okay.
All right.
So
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
I just said thank you.
Thank you, Beth. I just, again, I'm prepared. Deborah, are you prepared to move this application forward? And at this point in time, together with its resolution?
I am, and we could have further discussions on Monday if that's what people would like, but I'm prepared to move forward on this basis. I'm not prepared to make any amendments to it at this time.
So, and it does your motion, this obviously goes to a public hearing, so this is not a routine item. So this would be non-routine. And does your motion also support and approve the attached resolution by the Board of Estimate and Taxation in addition to the application itself, the appropriation?
It does. My motion covers both the amount, the recommendation, as well as the motions behind it.
And is there a second to that motion?
I guess.
As soon as I can unmute, I'll second the motion.
Thank you,
Okay.
Mr. Reamer.
And
So,
I would like to make an motion to.
Before we get to that, Leslie,
Mhm.
I would just like to see if I could just bring up Mike, just confirm that, this is we've never done any amendments to this. And so I would like to ask Mike if he could unmute himself and please speak to this. Michael
Morning,
Mason, our
everyone.
chairman of the BET, please.
Good morning, everyone. How are you? Michael Mason. So there's a resolution included in the document that came from Tyler for the 2020, July 1, 2020 through June 30, 2021 budget year. It clearly says in this document that we're approving that the Board of Estimate and Taxation shall annually make and file with the Office of the Town Clerk a detailed statement of the appropriation and its reasons for said appropriations deemed necessary to meet the expenses to conduct the affairs of the community development program. That's number one. So that's running of the office. Then the question I have is this one of those items that if we make a change, it has to go back to the first selectman for his or her approval? I'm wondering if that, but I do not see that. So as I read this legislative document with all the whereases, I believe that, don't hold me to this, I'll research it more. I didn't know this question was coming up, but I would say that there could be a modification to what comes from the CDBG. Our two representatives that were on there are going to have to give a report on this, on what was there. But I do believe the way I'm reading this, it can be modified. You heard Tyler talk about the dates and everything before. Those are all still applicable. So I think my answer is, I think, yes, you could make a motion to amend it.
Okay, thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. And, I wanted to, get your input and your experience on this before we moved ahead. So now I will call on Leslie Moriarty.
So I'm making a motion to amend to increase the amount of the Inspirica boiler replacement project by $16,000 and to reduce the Abalones ceiling lights project by that same $16,000.
I second the motion.
Okay, so I will call a vote on Leslie's motion.
No, I think there's some discussion.
Okay, I'd be happy for discussion. I thought we've been discussing this all along, but please, discussion.
Well, to Mrs. Moriarty first.
Ms. Moriarty, you want further discussion?
I'll keep it short. The commission reviewed these projects and feels like it needs to fund the boiler replacement in its entirety so it could be completed. And that program does benefit Greenwich residents. So I am just changing the judgment to the, changing the recommendation to the judgment of the committee.
Mr. Raymer?
So I listened thoughtfully to the remarks by Alexis. I thought that there was real wisdom in not repeating the problem that existed before with the boilers at the Housing Authority. I don't know how you, to Alexis's point about the three wheels of the fire truck, I feel like 48,000 out of 64,000 for the boilers at Inspirica feels like it's three wheels of the fire truck. Whereas I don't have the detail, but it did seem to me that 95,000, not quite, dollars of ceiling lighting and work does seem like something which can be separable. You can do 85% of the work, you can do 90% of the work, you can come back to it later on if the funding comes. I'm also mindful of the fact that we don't have homeless shelters in Greenwich. We rely upon homeless shelters in some of our neighboring communities. So it's rendering a service to Greenwich. It's not as if Greenwich has no homeless people. We do. I also don't want to be so myopic that I need to gauge things only based upon the head count of how many Greenwich residents are consuming a given service. We rely on the availability of these services. I'm sure that their ability to provide housing is dependent also on their having an operating boiler. I don't know how you provide housing if they don't. The Inspirica does a little bit more than just homeless housing. They also do vocational training and counseling. So, it's a little broader use than just that. So to my mind, I gladly second the motion and will support the motion. If the motion doesn't pass here at the Budget Committee, I would look forward to the motion being made again at the full BET. And at that point, I'd be grateful to know a little more information about, can we in fact stage the work at Abalones? Does the boiler at Inspirica, can that work go forward if they have only 48 out of $64,000? Those are all, I think, useful questions for us to consider as a full BET on Monday.
So Deborah, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I will not support it at this time because I just feel like I don't have enough information. I want to understand directly from the first selectman the rationale why the change was made. So I don't think it makes sense for us. It came up in a conversation. Willing to consider obviously anything, but I just think that it needs to, we need more information. Also, I actually, Leslie Tarkington, I believe Mike Mason had a question regarding the ability to, I don't know, for the motion in terms of increasing amount, et cetera. Maybe you could call on Mr. Mason. I think he had a comment.
No, I saw his hand up and I was planning to call on him, Deborah, so thank you. But I wanted to talk to all the committee members first when they had their hands raised. So I call on Mike Mason now, please.
The only technical question I have is, are we allowed, if I think I understand, if I understand this motion, you want to add money to the one program. I think that I don't have the answer to this, but I think the question really is going to be, would you be increasing the appropriation above the allocation at that point? Or would your motion need to increase $1 here and reduce $1 somewhere else? That would be my question. The RTM certainly can't increase it. There's no doubt. As I read this, this is the document we got from Tyler here. I've seen it before, but I'm reading it now. So,
Mike, just to clarify, my motion increased one and decreased the like amount in another line item within that same category of public facilities activity.
okay, so it's dollar neutral.
Dollar neutral.
Dollar neutral. It decreased Abalones from 94,756 to 78,756, and increased in Spirica from 48 to 64.
So and that'll lead the next question be, would this have to return to the office of the first selectman to agree or disagree with the programming? I looked through our policy manual while your conversations were going on. I haven't found anything there on that. So I'm reading through the resolution. So I'm sorry I don't have the answers for you on this right now, but.
So Mike, I would agree with you on that latter point. It seems to me that if our first selectman had a public meeting and the decision was made that this might have to return, but I do think that we have the benefit of a few days and we could do some additional research. I will also comment that similarly to Deborah, since there are some questions about this, I am not prepared to support this motion at this point in time. Obviously, they're both wonderful organizations, and obviously Alice is here in town. This is what's been presented by our first selectman, and that's where I was prepared to head. So should we take? I see other hands up, but they have the opportunity to talk at our full meeting, and I think we're in a vote within the budget committee. So with the support of the others on the committee, I will call for the actual vote. Leslie?
I'm voting in favor of the amendment.
Jeff Raymer?
In favor.
Deborah Hess?
I'm against it.
And this is Leslie Tarkington, and I'm also a no, so that motion has failed. Shall we now vote on unless people want to separate them? Deborah's motion was to combine them, both the application CD1 for $1,478,000 and $8,000, together with a supporting resolution by the Board of Estimate and Taxation in passing upon the report and the recommendations of the Budget Committee for the 2020, July 1st, 2020 through June 30th, 2021, close budget year. Again, exactly as presented. So, Leslie, I'll start with you again. On the original
I know
motion.
we're in the middle of the vote. The question that was going to come up is the fact that the RTM call deadline is tomorrow. And so what happens if the BET changes the proposed CDBG recommendations after the call, but that's another detail that needs to be researched. My vote on the grant and resolution is no.
No.
No, I want answers to these questions, and I want to register the fact that I have an open question.
Thank you. Jeff? Oh, well, I'll go Deborah. Deborah next.
Yes.
Jeff?
Yes.
And this is Leslie Tarkington, and I also vote yes. So this has passed with a vote of 3-1-0. And I thank both Alexis and Tyler for joining us for a conversation that has to be a record on the community development block grant at the budget committee meeting. I see Jeff laughing. I don't know whether he wants to confirm that at least it's a record during the time he has been with the BEG.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so should we move on to the health? And are you there, Caroline, being very patient? Caroline? Caroline Baisley?
Here.
Caroline, you need to unmute yourself. I think you just muted yourself.
Oh, okay.
So welcome.
Okay. I'm good. I'm in.
You're in.
Up as a panelist? Should I
Hi.
put you as a panelist?
Good afternoon. Okay, so actually, I was listening to part of the meeting and the discussion about the funding and the different sources, and I can shed a little bit of light onto it, even though they were talking about block grant. The money that is coming from the federal government is coming into the state, into several agencies, and it comes into the Department of Emergency Management, which is Homeland Security. It goes to the Department of Administrative Services, Department of Correction, and the Department of Health and the Military Department. And all these departments serve certain agencies, one of which is obviously, for us, the Department of Health is the Health Department. So how we're receiving not only supplies, but potentially the reimbursement for what we are spending is through the Department of Health. We're not going through, the FEMA piece of it or the DMAS piece of it, where I think I answered your email, Jeff, about how the distribution of some of the supplies are coming to businesses and potentially the residents of the town. That's a different distribution through through the state website or the town's website. I'm not quite sure. I can always get that information. But for the health department, we are dealing strictly with the state health department, and that's where we're getting reimbursement. This application is an example of that, and probably funding as well in the near future. So we can't tap into another source of funding. We can't tap into FEMA, which is from the DMAS part of it, and we can't tap into block grant. We can only get what we get through the Department of Health. So maybe that helps a little bit about the different funding that's coming through. Our hospitals get their own funding through the federal government, so they're not on that list that I just described. Okay.
Thank you, Caroline. Do you want to present your?
Sure. Okay, so this application is in the $17,855.96. It on the information that I submitted, there's two sheets. There's one for overtime expense that just shows the total, but it is included including in the total between the overtime expenses and the supplies. The total, has the fringe benefits as well in there for the total of $17,855.96. They did not on one of the items, and I couldn't tell you which item it was, that they gave us 23 approximately $23 and something cents less for an item that we had put down. And we got notification that they would consider payment for all of these expenses. They told us, don't just give us the invoices, give us the bills, don't give us what you paid for it, because we're going to make a determination. The only thing they did pay in full was all the staff's overtime and all the fringe benefits that go with it. They did do that. So this is for January 20th through March 31st. And we will be making application for reimbursement in the next day or so to the state for the month of April. And from that point forward, I don't know as to what they're going to give us. And that's
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Caroline, for the explanation. You know, again, thank you for always reaching out and looking for such grants or reimbursements. Any questions from the committee? So I saw Jeff's hands first. This is on the application, Jeff?
Yeah, yes. It's hard for me to answer that question, honestly. I wanted to take the opportunity, if I could, to ask Caroline to give us a little bit of a feel of what the experience has been over the last month and a half. That takes a little off the face of the application, but I think it would be worthwhile our hearing from Caroline to see how it all went and how it's going. We're not done.
Well, so Jeff, I agree with you, but I was just going to ask, you know, just get through this and then ask her if she could, you know, give us some of that experience. And then, you know, any other questions that you might have.
Okay, well, I'll ask some questions that are specific to the application.
Sure.
It's disappointing to me, but maybe we'll come back to it. Caroline, if I may, the list of supplies, first of all, I note that the list of supplies are basically office supplies. They're not medical supplies in any way. The list is a laminating machine, Pendaflex files, rubber bands, file folders, pads, toner, pens, etc. Have these items already been reimbursed or qualified? Are they approved items, or do they have to be?
Yeah, these are all, yes, these are all approved, plus the overtime and the benefits for the staff. The 17,000 whatever is here already, ready to be, you know, put into the correct accounts. And the medical supplies are not on here because they come directly from the state to the Department of Health for distribution to medical providers in the town of Greenwich. So we are in the process, so we pick up on Mondays, all health departments in the state pick up on Mondays. And basically we get gloves, we get face shields, we get no N95s, but we get what's called KN95s. We get a list of things that that doctors, surgical suites, oral surgeons, freestanding clinics can use, or if they don't have any and can't buy it, which is really the case. So this is coming, all these supplies are coming out of the national stockpile of the United States, and they're going to states, and then they're getting distributed. You know, some go to the hospital, but I'm not the distributor for the hospital. I have a specific list of people I can give to when I get, you know, when I get those supplies. So we're in the process of fielding, you know, there's a lot of emails and calls coming in from our medical providers in town, and we are looking at their needs and looking to see what we can support to them at this time. And it's, for example, you know, a lot of our dentists, our oral surgeons, a lot of them gave the hospital when this all started and there was very limited supplies, gave the hospital some of their supplies because they were closing, and now they're opening and now they can't get any supplies. So the departments of health in the state are now starting to replenish, or at least giving them something to open with. So that's, you're not going to see any medical supplies on the reimbursement at this time.
So that raised an interesting point. I don't know the answer to it, but if we receive a grant that's in dollars, it requires a process of approval. But you're indicating that there's a grant to us that came in kind of PPEs and face masks and gloves and maybe test kits or whatever. And as to those, there's no process of approval by the BET or the RTM, I gather. You said that you have a list of entities to which you either are allowed to distribute or which you had planned to distribute. Can I get a sense of who's on that list? To whom have you been distributing these supplies?
For our end of it is freestanding medical clinics, doctors' offices, oral surgeons, other kinds of dentistry operations. If we had any, diabetes clinics, oral renal dialysis units, that's of that nature. All of the PPEs that are coming into the state is coming from the federal government, coming from the national stockpile. The town of Greenwich is also receiving some of the masks and some other equipment that businesses are actually requesting all over the state. And I know that Dan had, there have been 2 pickups here at Town Hall, at least one I know of, maybe 2, of all the people, all the businesses in town that have requested some surgical masks and I guess some other materials that are able for them to get. They've been distributed already at Town Hall on a Saturday. The Selectman and the Director of Emergency Management, Dan, have a better sense on that, in that, because I really am not involved in that right now. We're very busy with, monitoring patients, doing contact tracing, and now we're doing as much as we can with the small supplies that we have to go to these medical providers. So, throughout the entire U.S., the national stockpile is being released, and it's just coming right down to where it belongs, because this is not only this is a global pandemic, a global emergency, and through the executive orders, I believe, of even the governor, that a lot of this stuff is relaxed. If it's money, we have to go through our own, obviously. If it's money, we have to go through our own processes at your local level in order to get funding. But we weren't even aware that this funding was going to be available to us. They just sent a memo, and I think I gave it to you, and it said, we're in a position to reimburse for what you've already spent, thus far for this, for this pandemic. But the supplies are a whole different ballgame. It has nothing to do with money.
So Jeff, you have more
just don't
questions
know
about the
offhand.
applicant?
I just don't know offhand whether or not there's an approval process that's required when we receive materials in kind. I just don't know the answer to that. In the event that somebody concludes that we are, do you have a record of what sort of quantity we've received and to whom we've distributed?
We sign for what we receive. I would imagine whatever comes to the town, Dan or the first selectman has gets a handle on whatever they get, because it gets distributed in each region. We have 5 regions within the state of Connecticut, and I read how many organizations are involved in terms of PPEs. And so there's a central site and a day of the week that you have to go. Health departments, like I said, go on Monday, and you have to sign for what you get. We do an inventory here, and then we have to give our inventory of what we gave out, what we have and what we gave out. So it's very much well organized in terms of what's coming into the state and what's leaving, what's being distributed. But there's no process under this condition, because it is getting received by being given to us by the national stockpile. In 2009, when we confronted the last pandemic, the H1N1 influenza pandemic, we received countermeasures, which was vaccine, released by the national stockpile. And it came via the health department at the state level. And, you know, we signed for what came to us. We requested what we needed and gave back what we didn't use and so on and so forth. But there was no, under the conditions of which we're operating right now, which is an extreme emergency situation, there's this process of what we're doing right now of what has to do with supplies. You couldn't possibly undertake a normal process, but there isn't one because if it's coming from the national stockpile.
So the answer to the question is yes, you have a record of what you received and you have a record of what you distributed, yeah?
Of course, that
have we retained any of these supplies? Are we used any of these for our own personnel, or is this really a process of just distribution?
We can only distribute what's on the list to who we can give to.
My question is a little different, Carolyn. My question was whether or not are some of our own personnel using these PPEs and gloves and masks? And
my staff is using what we had as a stock. I don't know whether or not other town agencies have what they have, where they've gotten theirs, but certainly my staff is not taking from this stock, but is taking from the stock that we had. In fact, we had a stock from the last pandemic and the one before that, which was in the early 2000s, actually. And we had some old supplies, and we had given some of our very old supplies, but they were still workable because they had nothing to GEMS. They had.
So should we be replenishing some of this stock? Were there any plan at the health department to try and accumulate again a stock of PPEs and masks and gloves?
Anything that we have gathered in large volume has come to us from the state, from the national stockpile. The stuff that I'm referring to that goes to my staff independently is we purchased that stuff with our funding from our department years ago. We have a nursing division. We run a lab. We have an STD clinic. We have to have these supplies on hand anyway. Do we have a lot of them? Absolutely not. You couldn't buy an N95 if your life depended on it right now. If it's not coming from the national stockpile, it's not coming.
So Jeff, do you have any more questions specifically about this application?
Yes. Sorry.
Okay.
You've been using up the stockpile that you had of these materials?
I don't think that's specific about this application. I think that refers to your other question that we're going to discuss afterwards.
So tell you what, let's, at your convenience, when you're ready, tell me, we'll move to the other question.
So you have no more specifics. Leslie, do you have any questions about the application?
I do, although it may straddle a little bit of what Jeff has. I was just curious in looking at the detail on the overtime. I guess I didn't know what to expect, but I was surprised sort of that it really only affects 4 employees predominantly in the health department. So I wanted to understand what activities have changed and what the response has been, because in some ways I would have thought it would have been a larger number.
Okay.
So I have a question then for the committee. Should we just sort of move into ask Caroline, what has she and her department been doing in this, pandemic emergency? And then from that, we'll understand better how the staff and so forth operated. Does someone want to move back into that?
Leslie, I'm sorry, may I ask 1 or 2 other questions on this particular application? I realized there was something else I meant to ask. To Roland. Roland, I see you're using an object code of 51950. Is that a new object code that you created for COVID?
All the COVID expenses are being captured in that line, and then there's also a project code attached to it. So if we run the project code, we'll have the revenues and the expenses throughout the town.
That was my second question. I've not before seen project codes on operating expenses.
Not very often, no.
Okay. All right. So this 51950, this is a separated line item that you're using for COVID.
Yes, and then the project code attached to it, I believe it's the
20400.
right. So the 2040 is a project code that everybody in the town uses to record the COVID costs.
Okay. The services, back to Carolyn for just a second. The lion's share, 5,000 some odd dollars of overtime each, was to Gina Lipson and Deborah Travers. Gina Lipson is the operations administrator. What was she doing by and large? What were we doing largely? Carolyn?
I think that that's going to be part of what I'm going to tell you what we've been doing.
All right. Well,
But you have some LIUNA people in their contract. We have everyone except for me. Let me put it to that way, is covered by a contract with the town, a labor contract. So during an emergency, the LIUNA, which is in this case, in this application, is I believe only 2 LIUNA people, or maybe 3. They get paid straight time, depending on what the contract says, straight time, and then I think time and a half if it exceeds a certain hours during that week or pay period. So they're also tabled in there. And then other members of the staff are GMEA. So in total, I had about 12 or 13 of us working on this. And all the LIUNA and all the GMEA staff got paid if they worked this part of the pandemic. Obviously, they got paid the overtime if they did overtime. And then I'll tell you what they were doing for that overtime, I think, in the next segment, because that really.
Okay, well, tell you what, maybe then to go to the next segment, but as you do it, I'd be grateful if you touch on what Ms. Lipson was doing, what Ms. Travers was doing. And then we have a part-time emergency medical coordinator that I know we fund year to year. I wouldn't mind to get a sense of what that person was doing and whether or not there was any overtime incurred by them. And then lastly, the Medical Reserve Corps that I know we fund. I wouldn't mind to get a sense of what the Medical Reserve, what your involvement with the Medical Reserve Corps was. And
Okay.
with those thoughts in mind, maybe, Madam Chairman, maybe it's appropriate to bring it back to you and ask that Ms. Baisley respond in a more general way.
Okay. So I just want to get the MRC people, the Medical Reserve Corps. They're all volunteers. There's 9 of us that have been working with the department on this pandemic. We don't pay them. They're strictly volunteers, and they are covered by the federal government for any liability, as long as they're doing what is within the realm of their license. So there's doctors, nurses, physician's assistants. I think, and that's all I have on my list so far. Okay, so as you know, this pandemic began in December of 2019 in China, but we were warned very early on, and we've been being warned forever that there would be a pandemic. It was just a matter of not, if, it was a matter of when. So, but we didn't know what kind of organism that we would be dealing with. So in January, after the disclosure to world health leaders that we were dealing with a pneumonia of unknown etiology in Asia, we obviously, the CDC realized that this could explode to something much larger than just an outbreak in China itself. And sure enough, it did. The Chinese government did an outstanding job of not only identifying the organism, which was an organism that we have never seen before, a coronavirus, a nasty one at that, and obviously shut down the whole continent over there. I mean, every border, everything was shut down. I think that gave us a little bit of time to get in preparation. So as of January 1, local health, state health, federal health were on alert. We reviewed all of our plans. We got all of our ducks in the order. We started to prepare for a pandemic here in this country. And at that time, we were then, people from China and some other locations in overseas, internationally, they started to leave in droves. And we were, the CDC had put up an extensive surveillance system coming into the US, and we started to receive people, mostly from China, but from other countries as well. And they were
Caroline, can we get, you know, again, we have other matters to handle, but can we just get closer to exactly what's been happening over, you know, we'll call it, you know, the period, you know, since we sort of all started, you know, addressing this issue. And then, you know, we need to make sure that we, you know, cover the key issues. But one of the questions that keeps coming into me is, are you on your iPad or computer? Can you?
I'm on my computer.
Can you go on video? We can't see your picture.
Oh,
Yep.
And people keep asking for your picture.
oh, I don't know how to do that.
Give us 1 second. She's going to reconnect.
Leslie, she may not have a camera. My computer doesn't have a camera, and IT had to give me a webcam to plug in.
Okay, so I think that explains it for our public that she might not have a camera. And so Caroline, can you just focus, you know, I sort of a very brief summary like you provided for the RTM, Health and Human Services Committee, in terms of what you've been doing? That would be great.
Okay, so what we've been doing, we started in January, but I'll fast forward to actually when we stopped doing the surveillance for people coming from China, and we had them under quarantine for 14 days. And then at that point, we started to get, you know, we started to see cases here in the United States. And when it hit, you know, obviously, you know, the United States, we started to see people who were traveling all over the United States and started to actually get cases here from the State Health Department that we were following up. Now, what I'm going to tell you, with the 9 people from the MRC and the 13 people that we have working with us, we started to do patient monitoring, which is a very labor-intensive, you know, operation. That means we got the information from the state, we made phone calls, interviewed everyone, and these are the people that were able to stay at home and be monitored by local health during their experience with this virus. And a mild case usually takes 2 weeks or more to resolve. The issue came down to, we had to track down who they were involved, which is the contact tracing piece, and we had to monitor all of the members of the family who unfortunately got COVID as a result. Now, as of today, we have 741 cases, and I'm going to give you an idea of the volume of what we were dealing with or still dealing with. I'm going to take for ease of numbers, I'm going to take 141 cases right off the bat. 40 plus are deceased. They probably weren't even monitored. They probably went into the hospital before we even got to monitor. And about 100 of these people we couldn't find for various reasons, but they came to us late. Of the 600 cases, okay, which is what, they're all residents of Greenwich, we took at least 2 and 3 of the people in the house, plus whatever their contacts. We have a volume, if we use the number 600, of about 2,000 cases. So 21 people that I just described were managing 21 cases. Right now we have 350 of those 600 active cases. And again, you apply the same kind of math. This is what we've been doing. It's overwhelming. It's put us in a great position because we did contact tracing from the very beginning. And now it's on a grand scale in the US. So we're way ahead of the ball game. And I can tell you one thing. The people that we monitored, and the new statistic from the state is that 66% of the COVID-19 cases in the US are mild cases, and our home isolating individual cases which are going to public health. So public health at the local level anywhere in the U.S. is overwhelmed with the amount of cases that they've been monitoring. The purpose of case management is so that these 1,800 people are not on the street infecting other people. They are home. They're isolated. We are monitoring them. They're not going anywhere. If the family has come down, even if they haven't come down with symptoms, they are under quarantine. I have issued a few quarantine and isolation orders for those who've been difficult. But on the whole, I can obviously say that all of our residents have been very abiding. Those who were ill were too ill to even think about going outside. And those who were asymptomatic, which they don't have symptoms and they could easily go out, they all abide by the quarantine and the isolation recommendations. And all of my staff and the volunteers call these people every single day, depending on the case, or every other day. And it doesn't, there's weekends involved. There were obviously holidays in between. And the purpose of monitoring them, not only to keep them off the street, but also to guide them in the experience that they were going to see. This virus has gone from to nuts. It started out with just, you having labored breathing, and you'd have temperature and maybe a cough. There's about 17 or 18 symptoms that are now on the list for this disease. And now we find that our children and our teenagers are seeing a latent response to exposure to this disease. And it is just tearing this place up. The United States is up because it's high fever, it's rash, it's labored breathing, and now our children are starting to exhibit latent symptoms of being exposed. So this is something that you can't fool around with. This is a very dangerous virus. It's explosive, it's highly contagious, and I think the health department and the volunteers and all the agencies that have been working on the town's response, the first selectman's office, the police department, the fire department, everybody, plus the hospital, who I personally had, workings with in order to get, we coordinated with their patients. So it's been an experience that has been very overwhelming, but that's basically what we've done. When we closed town hall on the 13th, 15th of March, all of my staff came to work. The health department's been in town hall every week, every day, working on this. And we're servicing so many residents. They're calling. We have 5 phone lines open. And we have numerous resources that we can tap into, which is great. And I can tell you one thing, that people were very gratified that we were here to help them, because there were, on many occasions, on all the people that we've served so far, not everyone just goes through recovery as quickly and as nicely as we would like. There were many people that had to go to the hospital. Unfortunately, some of our patients have died, and it's been a little tough on the staff as well as as anybody.
So Caroline, we really appreciate all the work that you and your department and everyone is doing. I think it's we'd like to hear more about this, at a future date. I think that obviously the departments that are working on this with the direct contacts are having a lot of stress and strain, and we are greatly appreciative of the risks that you all are taking, and the time and energy and emotion that's going into it. I see Deborah has her hand up. Deborah, do you have a question?
Thank you. Anybody who was listening can appreciate how hard the department's working and all that you're doing, and kind of what the residents of this town are facing. With that though, I do want to bring it back a little bit. I think we have a grant before us. While we could probably sit here for a long time and hear more from Carolyn about all the wonderful things and what they're doing to protect our community. I would like to bring it back and make the motion to support the grant. It's clear to me that we need to do that. And if we could maybe get, just put that on the table. So if I could, I'm ready to support this grant. I'd like to make that motion.
I agree. Thank you. Jeff seconds it.
No.
Those in favor?
I mean,
no.
I will second that motion, but before we leave, I had asked a few specific questions. You asked me if I would have those questions be handled under the more general comments.
Yeah, I have, but we're now at 1 o'clock, Jeff, and we have to begin to bring. This has been a lengthy session. I agree, and we'll follow up at another meeting without question. I think that there's a lot here to cover, and perhaps you're not going to get the answers exactly as you had asked them, and we spent a lot of time talking in this matter. So if you second this motion, can I take a vote now?
No, bear with me for just a moment. I don't mind if this is handled at a separate session later on, but I want to get some understanding at some point. I put it into an email to Ms. Baisley before we came here. I've asked the question twice during our session, and I'll handle it again at a later session, but I want to be sure that I'm very clear. I want to end up with some understanding of exactly what functions the emergency medical coordinator has been doing in this instance. I wanted to understand what Gina Lipson was doing with that's the principal recipient of the overtime. So too for Deborah Travers. We can come back to this at a later time, but I want to have some sense of how we handle these functions and where we're spending funds, particularly the funds that we spend on the emergency medical coordinator and on the medical reserve corps. And those are things that we really haven't discussed. We can do it later if you want, but I want to be sure we get back to it at some point. So you're going to put this on the agenda for a future meeting?
So I think any specific that relates to this application that hasn't been responded to, you're specific, Caroline, do you have any additional comments about quickly as to address Jeff's questions about the specific
medical
person?
reserve corps are volunteers. They don't get paid. There's no expenses with them. In fact, many of them use their cell phones because this is not personal contact interviewing. It's interviewing over the telephone or by Skype or whatever kind of communication tool that they are using. We did some of the supplies. We did have to purchase some, mobile, throwaway mobile phones, I call them. We buy we buy the phone, the actual phone, and then we put minutes on there. So we did give some of those out, but most of the people, my staff included, are using, if they have to call on weekends, they're using their own phones, so there's no expenses on that regard. But MRC people are volunteers, residents of the town, medical at that, and there is no expenses. Joanna actually was the workhorse of the entire department's operation. She is the one that actually retrieved and gave out all of those cases. Again, 600 cases, 700 cases, whatever, to each of the people who were doing the interviewing, and she coordinated all of this with the state of Connecticut. So she was the computer person on all of that. And my end of it was not only to attend to the medical people in town, work with the hospital to get their collection up, sample operation up and running, and to get people to areas where they were going to get screened and tested. And I also made sure that I went over each of the resident, each of the clients' issues, because we were dealing with people who could go aground very quickly and we could lose them very quickly. And so it was important for me to keep on every single one of my staff and understand each and every one of their patients, of what they were doing. And Mrs. Travers, who's also a Lyuna, and Mike Long, who's Lyuna, we were all doing patient care. The town was shut down. There was nothing, no restaurants, no nothing was open. We were engulfed with the pandemic. At this point, we are starting now to work with planning and zoning, the first selectman, on opening up, the restaurants, outdoor dining, as the governor starts to relax the regulations. we need to go back to our normal, if you can say normal, way of doing business perhaps. Town hall is still closed. I guess it's going to open sometime next week. So the new normal is not going to be normal. And we have to prepare ourselves for the next wave of this virus, which will come.
Ms. Baisley, let me do this perhaps if I can. If you don't mind, I'll try and couch some specific questions to you by an email, which then your responses I'll share with the rest of the budget committee, and then we'll let the chair make a decision at a future time as to whether or not it's worth having a further conversation at a future meeting that we set up for this. I think that might be better than to take your time today.
And Jeff, I'll add, we're going to see Caroline again because she's already told us that she's going to get another reimbursement, you know, from the state, et cetera. And so I expect we're going to be seeing Caroline next month and the month thereafter. So there will be a substantial additional time to address, you know, your questions if they haven't been responded to already.
Do you promise?
Well, no, she's already told us she's getting additional funds, which I think is, you know, Caroline is great at these kind of things. Leslie,
And I would just add, Mr. Raymer, if you could please just copy all of us on your.
Oh, I will.
Yeah,
I will.
So may I go back to my motion then to please support this grant? No?
And Jeff seconded it?
Yes.
Okay.
Those in favor? Deborah?
Aye.
So Deborah, Jeff, you want to say?
Yeah, aye. Oh, sorry. Jeff Raymer, aye.
Leslie?
You're on mute, Leslie.
You're muted.
Leslie Moriarty, yes.
Okay, great. So that's a 4-0-0. Great. Thank you so much. And Caroline, thank you much. And I assume we're going to be seeing you very soon based on what you told us. And thank you for all the good work and everything you've been going through. Roland, do you want to update us on the economic conditions? Roland, you're on mute.
Yeah. On the revenue page, we don't have anything for April. We're a little slow on getting the revenues posted. The cash is going in the bank, but the paperwork to get it posted is running behind schedule. Anecdotally, we're hearing that the building permits is, I believe, about 75% of what they think normal is. And conveyance is similarly doing quite well. They're pretty busy down there.
I'll add to this that, you know, in our Public Works liaison meeting that Amy indicated that, you know, they're following up in all their building inspections. And I think that they're probably at the 75%, you know, level relative to last year, which I think is amazing in today's environment.
Yeah,
so,
but you know, I mean, the conveyance taxes are based upon contracts of sale that were entered into before COVID hit. So I don't find that yet convincing. The building permits, that's a little more interesting. It means that even in March, although the figures for March are somewhat less, but even in March, people were going forward with work, I guess partly because they've done the planning for it, the architectural work and the like. I'll be curious to see what some of these look like for April and May. That'll be a little more interesting. I mean, the solace for the current year is that we're on track with the budget. The conveyance taxes are about 71% of the annual budget. We're about 75% at that point through the year. Building permits, we're at about 77% of budget, 75% of the way through the year. And on interest, because we had budgeted very low, at the end of April, we were still about 110% of the annual expectation of the annual budget there, which is, you know, which was good. Let's see what happens in the next month or two. That'll be more interesting.
So Roland, do you want to go through the run rate on our office?
On the expenses, you can see that the expenses have been slowing down. Last month, the 1920 expenditures were 8.2 million ahead of a year ago, March. This month through April, we're only $7.3 million spending ahead of March. So we picked up almost $900,000 in lower spending. And you can see one of the biggest pieces is the Board of Education. They were almost $1 million ahead of a year ago, and now it went down to 349,000.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see everything is slowing down here.
Right. Despite that, I see some departments like law department that are, you know, up substantially. Are there any questions here?
Yes, I have a question. On the expenses, the departments, the run rate would not include the accrual for the unresolved labor agreements. Is that correct?
No, that'll happen in June. We've sent notice out to all the departments saying before the end of the year that they need to encumber the increases that were budgeted.
And you also don't have a full sense of invoices that are unprocessed. So you don't know if there's a backlog going forward, although you've thought that there wasn't a tremendous amount of that last month, I think.
So Roland, is there any difference in the number of payrolls in this April 2020 year-to-date versus last year? Or is it the same number of payrolls?
It's the same number of payrolls.
Kenny,
Thank you.
do you have an answer to the unprocessed invoices? Do you have a feeling about that?
I mean, we're getting them in from all the departments. We're not sitting on any of them here.
Okay. And then at the end of the day, this comes back to the estimate of fund balance for fiscal 20. We had been going forward with the assumption that we'll probably end the year flat, no change in fiscal 20 versus fiscal 19. Are any of these new numbers making you think that there's a different outcome?
No, it's same. I think to one earlier point that Jeff made, we'll have a better feel on the revenues because they're way behind, more than a month behind in posting. We'll get a better feel for conveyance tax and building permits. The interest, they already made their budget. And then they're going to start, I know Town Hall is opening May 27th. I don't think there's a lag to your question, Leslie, about unprocessed invoices on the town side. However, I'm not sure. I don't know what's going on with the principals and all the middle, the elementary schools and the high school as far as unprocessed bills. But we'll get it. We'll probably, as each month goes by, get a better feel. But the answer to your question is still flat, $63 million. 68 million.
Thank you, Pete.
63 even, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. So thank you so much. Just for discussion and linking back into the environment and local market itself. The consumer price index actually in this area, prices were down 0.5%, 0.5% in this month, past month, April. I guess obviously the Bureau of Labor Statistics isn't doing as much the detail that they have before. They're obviously operating in the same kind of environment that we're all operating in. Any more questions on this, or should we move to approval of the minutes? Jeff?
One question. This is probably an unfair question, given you just said that there's unprocessed invoices, but are there any items of expense, of increased expense, that are notable from COVID?
The question came up earlier with Caroline. Them accounts that you referred before, the special accounts that are new, they're all being tracked there. I sent a spreadsheet out about 2 weeks ago. There was only about 56,000 in there. We actually tracked the 17,000. It was sent to the full BET. There's a spike in expenditures. The second attachment I sent was for Nathaniel Witherall, but it's notwithstanding the spike in Nathaniel Witherall, we tracked them and it doesn't look like there's an explosion or a large spike of expenses.
I'm looking at the project that we collect these costs, and there's about $91,000 in there.
Thank you for the update, Roland. Deborah, do you have something?
I just think that Mike Mason might, I know you're going through the committee first, but I think you may have missed it, has his hand up.
No, I mean, I have the other,
Oh, okay.
so
I'm good.
I'll call on Mike. Mike?
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. We're all following this and seeing this, and I think Mr. Raymer's got some interesting points on things. Peter, if I can, Peter Bernarski, did P&Z change something now on their collecting of their building permit fees? They're doing it different now, rather than when the permit is, when you get your permit, you pay. They're collecting the fee. Something is going on different right now. Can you help us with that?
Maybe Roland, I don't know what they're doing different.
Pete, I think they're talking about the fact that they're taking the revenue in at the building permits and saying, come back when you finish the rest of the land use processes. And those revenues are collected and deposited, but they haven't been posted yet because they didn't go through the process like it.
All right, so that's the answer to Mike's question.
Thank you. Thank you.
May I just add on to that? Do you record that as a revenue or do you wait because it's like a prepaid revenue?
It's not recorded until all the paperwork is done. Then it'll be revenue.
Thank you. Thank you.
The question, just to follow up, this was addressed a couple of minutes ago. The money is going in the bank. We're behind in putting it in Munis. What Roland just gave you was Munis. So there's more cash in the bank, and Munis hasn't caught up to the cash yet. And that's to go again back to Jeff's point. We'll have a better feel when all of the conveyance taxes posted in Munis and building permits.
Jeff?
Through you, Madam Chairman, to Mike, I'd be interested whether or not Mike has a feeling about the appropriateness of the handling of in-kind material that's received by a department of the town, that we don't go through any acceptance process of a grant when it comes to us in kind.
Well, I mean, you know the rule for the town accepting gifts, right? It's not our role to accept gifts unless it's a cash gift where we have to create an appropriation. However, with that said, I think, look, after this is over, we're going to need to really create a playbook for this town on how to handle these things. I can tell you that there were private donors delivering stuff at the Greenwich Hospital, at PD. I think departments were sharing supplies as they needed to. I think we know the answer to the question, but I don't think we were there in the streets at the same time either. I wish I had a better answer for you. I think we know the question, we know the answer, but I think when things were going as fast as they were and there were people running out of things, I think people were just, look, you might have had employees that were out there grabbing supplies for themselves. I mean, are they really giving the town a gift? I mean, it's a tough question. I just think right now we're not going to be able to really get a grip on all of that as we go forward until this settles down and we have a chance to look at it.
Jeff?
And I'd just like to add to Mike's point here. Also, we've looked at executive orders as they come to all of us, but we haven't necessarily looked at executive orders as they apply to the emergency stockpiles and so forth, which was what Caroline was talking about. I think those are the details and innuendos that Mike is talking about that, we need to get a better understanding of. But in the meantime, these departments are pressed and taking on a lot of responsibilities that they're not used to taking. So, I do think there's lessons
Roland was
learned.
going to say something.
For what it's worth, when we file the federal and state compliance report, apparently we've been receiving vaccines for the health department for many, many years. And there's no value for it. It just says vaccines received from the state. So the resolution talks about grants, but I don't know if those are grants in the form of always cash or whether it's things.
Well, those are good points too. I think we need to go back and look at some of this, in a calmer time. If the summer is calmer, we'll be looking this summer. I think we all can.
I believe this was addressed a couple of years ago with the piano, at the high school. There's resolution number 46. It's applicable to the Board of Ed. But you remember when we got the piano a couple of years ago?
Right.
Board of Ed addresses it, but to Jeff's question, I don't think the town properly addresses that. And to Mike's point, this is something that we have to look at because now we have a situation where we're receiving gifts that are not cash.
So that's something to do here. I think that this is well worthwhile in terms of the overall processes, and as Mike pointed out, it is emergency. So anyway, thank you, Roland. Any more comments on the economic report, or one way or another, or what we should be doing here, or just move on to minutes?
There are 2 hands raised from our
Oh,
attendees.
I'm sorry, Laura and Beth. I'll do Laura first because you have something on this.
No, I apologize. That was from earlier. Disregard. Thank you.
And Beth, you have something on this? Beth?
Mine was for earlier, sorry.
Okay. So should we move on then? Roland, nothing more, right?
No.
How about the minutes from the Tuesday, April 14th meeting?
I'll move.
Do you have a motion?
I'll make a motion for the minutes.
Seconded.
And those in favor, we'll start with Jeff. Oh, Deborah,
Aye.
we'll start with Deborah. She made the motion.
Okay.
Deborah?
Deborah, aye.
Yes. Jeff Raymer,
Jeff Raymer's an aye.
Leslie Moriarty,
Leslie Moriarty, yes.
and Leslie Tarkington is also a yes. So that's 400. So with that, we will sign. Do we have a motion to adjourn? But before I allow that, I'm just going to remind everyone that the next meeting is on Monday, June 8th at 10 o'clock. So the motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Deborah?
Yep.
Second by Jeff?
Yes.
Okay, so we are
Thank you.
adjourned. It is 1:21. Thank you all.
Bye.
Goodbye.